Hi, I'm Clarabelle, and this is the story of how my name, just 9 letters, was taken, used, and nearly erased by the very people who were supposed to protect it. It started with a mortgage I didn't sign, and a smile my mother mistook for surrender. But what stayed with me wasn't the debt or the betrayal. It was the silence I turned into a case file, and the moment I chose to write myself back in. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like your value was only measured by what others could take from you? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. The morning started with daffodils blooming under the mailbox, and a phone call that made the ground tilt under me. Mount Joy woke up slowly, the way a small town should. The streets were still wet from last night's drizzle, and the wind carried that faint bite of winter, refusing to let go, even as March gave its last breath. I always liked mornings like this, quiet, orderly, predictable, the kind that made you believe nothing big could happen. I padded barefoot across the cool floor of my second-story apartment, the kettle already hissing on the stove. Outside my window, I could see the regulars filing into Dot's place. Old men with newspapers tucked under their arms, the retired school librarian with her rescue dachshund in a sling, and Ruth, the waitress who knew everyone's order before they sat down. She was setting out the last of the morning specials, a tray of cinnamon waffles, and a handwritten sign that read, "Bless your belly and your soul." Frances Bellamy sat in her usual spot by the window. She was folded into herself like a page someone had dog-eared, quiet, content. I didn't know her well, just that she always carried a canvas bag embroidered with wildflowers and had the soft, steady gaze of someone who had long since stopped rushing through anything. She caught my eye and offered the smallest nod. I nodded back. The kettle squealed, and I poured my tea, dropping in the last sachet of chamomile I had left. I cupped the mug in both hands, breathing in the steam. The moment felt full. Still. Then the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I should have let it go. If it wasn't on my calendar, it wasn't part of the plan. But I picked it up anyway. Ms. Clarabelle Monroe? Yes, speaking. This is Brian White with Liberty National Bank. We're contacting you regarding the outstanding mortgage balance on property ID ending in 4710. The current balance is $502,376. There was no air in the room. You have the wrong person. No, ma'am. We've confirmed name, date of birth, and social security number. The mortgage was finalized on March 3rd. I laughed, but it sounded cracked. I haven't bought a house. I understand. Would you like a digital copy of the loan documentation? My lips parted, but no sound came. My hand tightened around the mug. I ended the call without saying goodbye. I didn't move for a long while. Eventually, I made my way to the old kitchen drawer, the one where forgotten things lived: takeout menus, dried pens, and unopened mail. It took me a minute to find the envelope with the Liberty National logo. I hadn't even opened it when it arrived. Inside, a letter with my name printed neatly, welcoming me as a mortgage holder. My name, my address, my debt. I dropped into the nearest chair. The steam from my tea had vanished. Outside, a wind gust set the wind chimes at Dot's place into motion. I could hear Ruth's laugh float through the open door. I rose on unsteady feet and crossed to my file cabinet. Everything I ever kept just in case was here. College forms I'd filled out for Chelsea, old hospital documents I'd signed for Mom, even the tax filings I used to prepare for both of them when Chelsea said TurboTax made her dizzy. I ran my fingers over the folders, one by one, like I was tracing my own story backward. Back at my desk, my laptop chimed. The email had arrived. Subject line: Mortgage confirmation, Liberty National. I clicked. My eyes scanned the document. There it was. My full name, my SSN, The property address was in Mount Joy. The loan amount, $502,376. A digital signature affixed to the bottom. Elegant, familiar. I leaned in closer. The C curved too perfectly. The M in Monroe was tighter than mine ever was. The signature was mine in shape, but not in weight, like someone had studied it, rehearsed it. The date? March 3rd. I blinked. That was the day I'd been taken to the ER after eating a catered salad at work that wasn't labeled properly. Shellfish. I'd gone into anaphylaxis. I remembered the sirens, the flashes of ceiling tiles as the gurney rolled me in, and the beeping of machines after. I had been unconscious the entire afternoon. I checked my phone again, staring at the timestamp. The document was signed at 3:14 p.m. I hadn't signed anything, but someone had. And I had a feeling I knew who. My mother has always had a way of making betrayal sound like family tradition. She had this voice, soft, steady, almost melodic, that could wrap even the worst news in a ribbon of rationale. I used to admire it. Now, it just made my teeth ache. I drove to her house on Walnut Street with the heater turned low and my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. The tulips in her front yard had bloomed early this year, bright yellows and pinks that danced a little too joyfully in the breeze for what I was walking into. The porch light was already on, casting a warm glow across the brick steps. I rang the bell, though I still had a key. I hadn't used it in months. Diane opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Clarabelle, darling, you made it just in time." Inside, everything smelled exactly the same. Meatloaf, buttery mashed potatoes, and that unnaturally sweet cherry jello dessert she insisted was a tradition. The dining room hadn't changed either. The same framed needlepoint quotes lined the walls. "Family is forever. Bless this home." And the heavy oak table still bore the faint scratch marks from where Chelsea had carved her initials in middle school. Chelsea herself swept in from the kitchen, all smiles and shimmer. "Oh my God, Belle, I told Mom you'd show. You never miss meatloaf night." I didn't bother correcting her. We sat. I was placed at the far end of the table, a spot that used to be reserved for guests or the cousin who chewed with his mouth open. Diane poured wine into mismatched glasses, hers the crystal one she always kept for herself. "So," she began, "Chelsea's been picking wedding colors. Isn't that exciting?" I cleared my throat. "We need to talk about the house." The air shifted. Diane's smile didn't move, but her hand froze on the wine bottle. "What about it?" "There's a mortgage in my name, $500,000. It was finalized while I was in the hospital." She set the bottle down gently, like she was placing a newborn in a crib. "Oh, sweetheart, that's what this is about?" Chelsea looked confused for half a second, then smoothed her expression into something sunnier. "It's not a big deal, Belle. It's just paperwork. Ron and I, this house means everything to us." I stared at her. "You mean the house I'm apparently financially responsible for?" Diane tilted her head. "You weren't using your credit, sweetie, and we knew you'd understand. You always do." That word. Understand. As if I was born to absorb the shocks so they could keep dancing. Chelsea reached across the table and squeezed my hand like I was the one who needed comforting. "You've always been the calm one, the practical one. You know that, right?" I pulled my hand back. "So, you just assumed I wouldn't mind being lied to?" Diane's tone dropped into that soft register she used when I scraped my knee as a child. "It's not lying, Clarabelle. It's helping. You've always helped. FAFSA forms, car paperwork, even that gym membership you signed for Chelsea." My breath caught. So this wasn't new. This was just the next step in a pattern I hadn't seen clearly until now. "You're always so calm," Diane added, like that explained everything. I knew you'd take it well. Something shifted in me then. Not rage, not sadness, just clarity. Chelsea was slicing into the meatloaf, chatting about cake tastings, when she said it. Not with malice, just with that airy, absent-minded Chelseaness that made every word land sharper than it should. You don't even have a family, Clarabelle. Ron and I. This is our start. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her and smiled. You're right, I don't. We finished the meal in near silence after that. Diane made some comment about place cards. Chelsea offered to send me Pinterest links. I nodded politely and excused myself. Outside, the wind had picked up. I walked to my car, the tulips swaying behind me like nothing had happened. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door gently. The silence inside felt padded, like the world had pressed pause. On the passenger seat was an envelope Diane had handed me at the door. I hadn't looked at it until now. I opened it slowly. Inside was a wedding invitation. Chelsea and Ron, it read, with love from Diane. I got out of the car and closed the door gently. In my hand was a wedding invitation that read, Chelsea and Ron, with love from Diane. I realized that sometimes family is not the place that loves you the most. Sometimes they take away your rights to serve their own personal purposes. It feels like they are taking advantage of me. If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comments section below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. The worst wounds I ever had were from paper. FAFSA forms, notarized lies, and letters never meant for me. There was a drawer in my apartment that I hadn't opened in months, maybe longer. It held every file I thought might matter one day. Tax returns, doctor's notes, even the lease for the car Chelsea borrowed and never gave back. I had started calling it my museum of mistaken trust. Outside, a steady mist blurred the streetlights along Main. It wasn't raining hard, but just enough to keep the pavement slick and the windows soft with fog. The kind of weather that made people lean into their coats and walk a little faster. I preferred it. It gave me cover. The folder marked Medical 2023 was wedged between 2 others that had long since curled at the edges. I pulled it out with the same care I'd use for a wound I didn't want to reopen, but had no choice but to clean. My fingers hesitated over the ER report from March 3rd. The admission time, 2:12 p.m., status upon arrival. Unconscious, assisted ventilation required. Time stabilized, 5:19 p.m. I remembered none of it, just flashes, the overhead lights, the plastic taste of oxygen. I remembered waking up groggy and alone, my mother sitting in the corner, flipping through a Better Homes and Gardens magazine, like she wasn't watching her daughter return to the world. That timestamp burned in my head. March 3rd. The same afternoon, the mortgage was signed. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Samantha's name. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but I remembered she'd started working in medical records at Lancaster General. I took a chance. She picked up on the second ring. Clary? Wow, this is a surprise. I know. Sorry for jumping in like this, but I need a favor. Samantha didn't even hesitate. Say the word. Within an hour, she'd called back. There's camera footage from the ER hallway. You're brought in at 2:12, and your mom enters your room at 2:47. You don't move at all during the recording. My stomach dropped. And the signature on the mortgage? She didn't answer, but I already knew. The mortgage was signed at 3:11 p.m. I thanked her quietly and hung up. Later that afternoon, I walked to Dot's place. I needed air and something stronger than chamomile. Ruth gave me a knowing smile as she poured me a ginger tea and pointed me to the booth in the back. Francis Bellamy's usual spot. To my surprise, it was empty, but just as I turned to leave, Frances stepped through the door, tugging her scarf loose. She spotted me, then paused, as if deciding something. Finally, she walked over. "You're in my seat," she said, but not unkindly. "I can move." She raised a hand. "Number sit. I'll join you." We didn't speak for the first few minutes. Just two women breathing in the quiet hum of the diner, the clatter of forks, the low murmur of lives continuing. Finally, I said, "Do you ever get the feeling someone used your name like it wasn't yours?" She stirred her tea. "My nephew did, back in '87. Opened a hardware account, bought a whole generator setup. I didn't know until the debt collectors found me." I blinked. "What did you do?" Frances took a sip. "Paid it off. Wasn't worth the family drama." She smiled, sad and small. "If I could go back, I would have spoken up sooner." I nodded. "I'm trying to." She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a tiny bunch of daffodils. Fresh, not from the market. She laid them on the table. "They're from my yard. You look like you could use something that bloomed on purpose." I didn't know what to say. It was the first thing anyone had given me in months that wasn't tied to obligation. I walked home in the mist, her words still tucked somewhere behind my ribs. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. My hands trembled only slightly as I wrote down the sequence. 2:12 p.m. Admitted 2:47 p.m. Diane enters room 311 p.m. Mortgage signed, I underlined the last one. Then I stared at the top of the page, the blank space waiting for a title. My pen hovered, then pressed down in one firm stroke. That night, I didn't cry. I just wrote one word on the top of a yellow legal pad: reclamation. They took my silence as agreement and my smile as surrender. I let them, until now. The morning sky hung low over Mount Joy, painted in shades of dull pewter. I wrapped my scarf twice around my neck, not for warmth, but for certainty. There was something about gray skies that always made me feel braver, maybe because the world already looked like it was holding its breath. I crossed Main Street just as Dot's place flicked its lights on. Ruth was already arranging the window display, lemon bars on a tiered plate, butter biscuits under glass. She waved at me through the foggy pane, but I didn't wave back. My hands were full, with a manila folder stuffed to the seams and the weight of a decision I'd avoided for too long. Reuben Clark's office sat in a narrow red brick building just across from the courthouse. The glass on the door still bore his father's name, ghosted beneath his own. I pushed it open and was greeted by the scent of old paper and something vaguely lemon-scented, floor polish, or maybe the cleaner used on the stiff fabric chairs lined up in the waiting area. A man in his late 50s emerged from behind a stack of dusty files, coffee mug in hand. "You must be Clarabelle Monroe," he said, not quite smiling, but not cold either. "Yes. Thank you for seeing me." "Come in. Let's get into it." His office was cramped but methodical, with case files stacked like geological layers and an old coffee machine burbling quietly in the corner. I sat across from him, the folder in my lap already beginning to sweat at the edges from my palms. "I believe," I began, "that my name was used, stolen, to sign a mortgage while I was unconscious in the hospital. I have documents and timestamps." I laid them out one by one: the hospital intake forms, the security footage stills, the email from Samantha, and the mortgage file with the forged signature. Clark's expression didn't change much, but his posture shifted, slightly forward, alert. "Hospital timestamp shows unconscious at 2:29. Your mother enters at 2:47. Signature logs at 3:11. He tapped a pen against his notepad. This is not just immoral, it's unlawful, possibly fraudulent conveyance, definitely identity misuse. And because it's family, we call this familial fraud. It's more common than people think. I nodded slowly, my breath shallow. If I pursue this, what happens? The moment you file, he said, leaning back, everything changes. The weight of that sentence settled in the crook of my collarbone. Not just legally, personally, everything. There was a soft knock on the door. Sorry, came Frances's voice. She stood in the doorway with her usual canvas bag and a look that said she hadn't meant to interrupt, only to bear witness. I brought you that thing I mentioned, Clarabelle. She stepped inside and handed me a small worn notebook. The cover was soft, blue fabric fading at the edges. In case you need strength that isn't your own, she said simply. Clark looked from me to her, then nodded as if it all made sense. Frances turned to leave but paused at the door. Don't wait 10 years like I did. I'm still paying off my sister's loan. I looked down at the notebook in my hands. Its pages were filled with pressed leaves, handwritten affirmations, little clipped quotes, and prayers in slanted cursive. Not magic, not a plan, just reminders. Clark slid the affidavit toward me. We can file this today. You just need to sign. The pen felt heavier than it should have. My hand hovered for a second. Then I lowered the tip and signed my name in steady, deliberate strokes. It didn't feel like taking revenge. It felt like taking something back. They used my name, I said, folding the papers. Now it's my turn to use it. They used my quiet as cover, but I turned it into a case file. I walked into the meeting room at Mount Joy Town Hall, wearing the gray trench coat I kept for job interviews and funerals. It hung heavy on my shoulders, but not as heavy as the silence I was about to break. The room smelled faintly of floor polish and wet coats. Rain still tapped lightly at the windows, though the forecast said it would stop by noon. Inside, the council table stretched long and polished, dotted with pitchers of water, folded nameplates, and a modest tray of shortbread cookies no one seemed interested in. The HOA board sat in the center, already flipping through their packets. A representative from Liberty Bank took the far-right seat, fidgeting with his tie. Across from them sat my mother and Chelsea, both dressed as though they were attending a brunch, not a hearing. Reuben Clark, composed as ever, was already reviewing his notes beside me. He didn't smile when I sat down. He didn't need to. His quiet presence was enough. Diane glanced over, her lips forming a polite, almost pitying curve. Chelsea looked past me, fixing her hair in the reflection of a silver carafe. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping them still. I wasn't here to tremble. The board chair called the meeting to order, voice clipped but not unkind. Clark began. He laid out every piece like a lawyer laying bricks. Deliberate, solid, inarguable. Hospital admission logs. Surveillance footage from 2:47 p.m., showing my mother entering my hospital room while I was unconscious. The signature, time-stamped at 3:11 p.m., matched with my condition report. Ventilated, nonverbal. A notarized handwriting analysis. Then the floor opened for response. Diane leaned in, voice as smooth as honey warmed in the microwave. It was all done for the family. Clarabelle wasn't using her credit. Chelsea and Ron needed a start. We thought, she smiled faintly, that Clarabelle would want to be part of something meaningful. The room was still. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then, Frances Bellamy stood up from the back row. She wore a wool dress the color of dusk and carried her canvas bag tucked under one arm. In her hand, a small dog-eared notebook. I hadn't seen her come in, but she was here now, tall in presence, if not stature. "I'd like to speak," she said. The chair nodded. "I was there," Frances began, voice steady. "At Dot's place, a few weeks ago. Diane Monroe sat in the booth behind me and told her daughter Chelsea, 'Clarabelle doesn't need to know. She never makes a fuss.'" Her words. I wrote them down. She opened her notebook. Page 7, March 21st. Chelsea paled. Diane blinked, as if betrayed by her own voice echoing back at her. The board murmured. The Liberty Bank representative scribbled something down. The chair turned to Clark. "Given the documentation and the testimony, we're issuing a temporary freeze on the disputed property. Liberty Bank will conduct an internal review. In the meantime, Diane and Chelsea Monroe are not to access or alter any financial account or property asset tied to Clarabelle Monroe." Neither of them said a word. For once, the silence belonged to them. Then Diane stood. Her voice cracked, not from emotion, but from control slipping. "You do this to your own mother?" I looked at her. I didn't shake. I didn't whisper. "You did it first." The sound of the gavel was soft but final. The meeting adjourned. I stepped outside into a world washed clean. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet pavement and something faintly green. New grass, maybe. I didn't smile, but I stood taller than I ever had. I didn't walk away to win. I walked away because staying meant disappearing. The early May sun filtered through the sycamores like gold dust. Mountjoy's open-air market was already alive, scented with cinnamon, fresh coffee, and the crispness that only came with Sundays that didn't rush you. I parked at the far end and carried 2 boxes across the lawn, past the man tuning his mandolin near the fountain, and the retired librarian setting up her folding table of weathered books. Everyone knew everyone here, but today I wasn't here as a daughter or a +1. I was Clarabelle Monroe, and this was still standing pottery. My booth wasn't much, just a folding table draped in sage green linen and a wooden sign I painted by hand. But the pieces mattered. Dozens of cups, bowls, and plates, each one glazed in soft earth tones, each one bearing its own tiny fracture sealed with golden resin. Kintsugi style, not to hide the breaks, but to honor them. Frances arrived a little after 8, carrying a thermos of tea and a tin of lemon shortbread she claimed were too ugly to sell but perfect for eating. She wore her navy cardigan and her usual quiet pride. Without asking, she began arranging mugs in clusters of 3s. "Still standing," she read aloud from one of the larger bowls. "Strong words." I nodded. It took me a while to earn them. A couple strolled by with a corgi in a sweater, and a man with a camera asked to photograph the display. I didn't pose. I didn't need to. Mid-morning, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes picked up a cracked cup, the gold seam glinting in the light. "Why does this one say, 'Still standing'?" she asked. I smiled gently. "Because that's what it took to get here." She cradled the mug in both hands like it had a heartbeat, then added it to her basket. Frances poured tea from one of the kettles I'd fired last week, the steam curling into the spring air. From my corner, I caught sight of her. Diane. She stood by the honey stand across the way, arms folded, watching. She looked smaller than I remembered. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Just that. No nod, no step forward. And that was enough. I turned back to my booth. Later, while rearranging a stack of shallow bowls, I reached into my satchel for something I'd almost left at home. A pale blue envelope with my grandmother's handwriting. I'd found it tucked in the back of an old cookbook weeks ago, but today felt like the right day to open it. Inside was a short letter. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and cloves. "My dearest Clarabelle, if they erase you, you draw yourself back in. Love, always, Grandma. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I folded the note and slid it into the drawer beneath the cash box, next to the smoothest bowl I'd ever made. Business slowed after noon. The sun shifted, shadows stretched. Frances handed me a cup of tea and sat beside me in the folding chair we shared like an old porch swing. "Funny," she said, "how something cracked can end up stronger than when it was whole." I didn't answer right away. I just watched the wind ripple through the fabric of the booth, watched people pass by with their treasures, their dogs, their Sunday peace. I wasn't erased. I was rewritten, this time in my own handwriting. Some people break your name into pieces before you even know it's missing, and some help you put it back together without asking for thanks. My journey reminds us that quiet strength is still strength, and reclaiming your voice doesn't always mean raising it. True kindness doesn't require applause. It shows up in small acts, in quiet support, in the courage to stand when no one expected you to. Like the gold seams in my pottery, the cracks we carry can become the most beautiful part of us, if we choose to mend instead of hide them. If this story touched something in you, maybe today is a good day to notice someone quietly standing their ground and remind them they're not alone.